Welcome back to NewsX. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. For many pressing international and domestic matters that shape global politics, the role of varied organisations matter significantly. So, can BRICS reshape global governance and challenge the dominance of the US dollar? How will South Africa's decisions on Putin and Ukraine influence its foreign relations? What role can the Global South play in peace efforts in Eastern Europe? Let's find out. Joining us is Kim Heller. She is a South African political analyst, writer and advocate for economic justice. Heller is popularly known for her book No White Lies, Black Politics and White Power in South Africa. She is a vocal advocate for land justice and reparations for apartheid-era injustices. Beyond writing, she actively participates in discussions on South African politics. Thank you, Kim Heller, for joining us. My first question to you is, do you feel BRICS can be an alternative to the UN?
Certainly. I think BRICS, in many ways, is the new world. But I'm not sure that it's going to be coming as quickly as certain people may or countries may think, because I think in the construction of a new paradigm, it not only requires a shift in economic power and the logistics around that, but a shift in mindset, one of self-sufficiency on BRICS countries rather than the historic reliance on Western nations. So certainly it's a new world. I think it's very important for developing nations, but I think it's going to take a long time to birth and come into effect.
Do you think BRICS has the potential to dethrone the dollar? What do you make of Trump's threat of 100% tariffs if BRICS replaces the dollar?
That's an interesting question, because I think of all presidents, Donald Trump doesn't make threats lightly. And I think he's quite alarmed at the power that would be taken away from America, both in terms of economic power and almost legitimacy as a political entity, if BRICS had to de-dollarize. I think his threats are a way of preserving power within the Western nations. And I do think he will penalize countries. It's not going to be the first time that he does that. But I think that, as I was saying now, I think the de-dollarization is going to take a lot longer than envisaged. So I don't think it's an imminent threat to Western powers, nor is it an immediate solution or a short-term solution to the BRICS nations.
South Africa will have to disinvite Putin for next G20 summit in wake of ICC arrest warrants. Will this strain its ties with Russia?
South Africa, I think, of all countries in the African continent, has a very solid relationship with Russia. We've had a historical relationship, so that even under apartheid and the racist apartheid regime, Russia stood by South Africa. It stood by the Black people of this country. And the relationship is very solid. Just recently, our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, spoke to the fact that Russia is a friend. So I think there's very little that's going to damage that relationship. I think it's just compliance with the UN law, which we don't agree with necessarily, but we wouldn't want Vladimir Putin to come to South Africa and be arrested by some right-wing elements. Now, even within the South African government, the government has partnered with quite conservative, white, Ukrainian-supporting political parties. So it would be a deep threat if Putin arrived on our shores, because I think there would be some within the government of national unity that would want to see his arrest. So I think that there would be an understanding between Putin and Ramaphosa that this is the only way to proceed. I think the relationships are very, very solid. And I don't think such a protocol such as this, a forced protocol through the UN, would cause any damage to a very, very strong relationship between Russia and South Africa.
What role can South Africa and Global South play in negotiating peace in East Europe?
I think there was an attempt last year where quite a high-level delegation from Africa, led by our president Cyril Ramaphosa, went through to Ukraine to try and broker some peace. And it was quite an interesting summit. We need to understand that the African leaders were driven perhaps not by any particular political agenda, either of Russia or Ukraine, but by their need to ensure food security, because the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine has damaged food stability in Africa, because we're very reliant on grain and fertilizer from those two nations. So there's a lot of interest in a negotiated settlement for Africa, because we are currently suffering due to that. But I think as far as the potency of Africa's leaders to help bring a ceasefire or a settlement to Ukraine, Russia is very limited, because I think our leaders don't have the magnitude or the political force or economic power to make too much difference. So all we are really is another voice amongst voices. And I must say, in Africa, there's been a lot of criticism of African leaders going to such peace summits when in our own continent we have terrible crises in DRC and Sudan. And there's a lot of questioning of why our own leaders are not rushing to those sites and bringing about peace, but more interested in what's happening in Europe. So it's a double-edged sword, I think, for African leaders.
Do you think South Africa's Ukraine visa deal will perturb Russia? Will it dent South Africa-Russia ties? Why are there differing views within the unity government in the country on this deal?
The Ukraine deal, which actually involved that Ukraine diplomats could travel to South Africa visa-free, caused a big storm in South Africa, because that initiative was actually formalized by the Democratic Alliance, who is the major partner with the ANC in our new government of national unity. Now, the DA leader, John Steenhuisen, last year or the year before, went to Ukraine and has visibly expressed his support for the Ukrainians, and he's very anti-Russia. But that move, the visa move with Ukraine, was really condemned by the leading party in the government of national unity, which is the ANC. And it said the move was made without the approval of the governing party, the ANC. So I think that was more about an internal battle between the ANC, which has been in power in South Africa as a liberation movement, and a very Western-focused, Western-aligned Democratic Alliance, which has historically been the white power privileged party, and who have openly expressed support for Ukraine. But they are not the major player in South African politics. And I think it was just a tactical move and a silly move and an unauthorized move by the Democratic Alliance to try and shift diplomatic ties. And actually within that, just to understand the context of that, is that when Cyril Ramaphosa recently spoke about Russia being a great ally of South Africa, the response of the white-focused Democratic Alliance was to condemn that statement and say Russia is no friend of ours. And in fact, we side with Ukraine. But the DA, the Democratic Alliance, expresses the voice largely of a white population in South Africa. I can convincingly say that most South Africans in this country stand with Russia. And the government, the ANC, the major player, still stands with Russia. So I think it was an unfortunate diplomatic error, but I don't see any long-term damage to the very, very strong relationship with Russia.
How do you view the Israel-Hamas war? Ceasefire not in sight, and Israeli strikes are causing more deaths on Gaza Strip.
We spent what we would call a festive season, Christmas beckoning, and yet there's no peace. And Israel continues to bomb and devastate Gaza, despite the ruling of both the ICC and ICJ. And obviously, South Africa was a very big supporter of the people of Palestine by taking this matter to the greatest, the highest court in the world. And yet, Israel once again has shown that it's above international law. Nobody can stop the brutality of Israel except for the United States. And we see the United States supporting a genocide that is happening in real time. Yet around the world, there's no organ or court of law or country or power that is able to stop this carnage. And certainly South Africa has been amongst the nations that have supported Palestine historically and today. And we can only send our deep condolences to the people of Palestine, and also speak with shame at world leaders who are not standing up for what is happening to innocent people in Palestine.
Why are political parties divided on the subject of Bella Act that has been implemented by the South African president?
The Bella Act is probably the most radical change in legislation, in educational legislation in South Africa since 1994. Because in apartheid, we had a very, very divided and unequal educational system. And that inequality has continued into a free South Africa. So the Bella Act tries to, amongst other things, change the powers to make sure, I'm trying to explain it in a very quick way, to make sure that African children are allowed the liberty of being taught in their own language, and the powers being taken away from school governance and parent associations. This is the clause, amongst others, that is causing a lot of conflict between the ANC and its alliance partner, the Democratic Alliance. Now, the reason for this is the Democratic Alliance is trying to maintain the power of Afrikaans, actually, and English. These are the language of the colonialists who did a lot of damage to South Africa and destroyed the educational system of Black South Africans. So they're objecting to the fact that now an African child could be taught in his or her own language. It's a really sad episode which shows that South Africa is not yet free, that democracy is not really working, that the former oppressor, the white man and the white woman, can still impose that the language of the oppressor is taught, and that young African children are still taught in that language rather than in their own language. So it's a very contested playing field. Yesterday, it was signed into law that the Bella Act would go ahead. One of the other things that it does is that it safeguards the right of children, even if they're here from other African countries and undocumented. It safeguards their right to education. So it's a very progressive bill. I think we can expect from the white population a pullback, because they want to preserve their privilege and their languages. And in South Africa, the prominence of African languages has yet not been given pride of place in any schools. So I think it's a very important move, and I do commend the ANC on pushing this. I think it speaks to the dignity of the African child in South Africa and the rights of young African children to be taught in their mother language.
Why has President Ramaphosa come under heavy criticism for allegedly entrenching white dominance and economic inequality in the country?
A lot of people, particularly across the world, see South Africa as a free, democratic country, as a miracle nation. But what is true is that economic disparity continues. In fact, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, despite us being seen as the miracle nation of Nelson Mandela. So what's happened is that the ANC, particularly under Cyril Ramaphosa, has not managed to bring about economic equity So most of the land is still in the hands of white people, around 70%. Ownership of big business and the economy is still in the hands of white people. And bearing in mind that we the former oppressors in the country, and yet democracy has not taken away our privilege, and Black people continue to suffer. And it's not only Cyril Ramaphosa, it's the ANC government that has sided with white capital, has sided with Western markets, and has preserved white power. But Cyril Ramaphosa in particular has come under a lot of criticism because if you remember the Marikana massacre in 2012, where 35 miners were gunned down by security forces simply for asking for a living wage. And Cyril Ramaphosa at that point sided with white capital. And we saw the death, the terrible death of Black workers who were simply asking for a living wage so that they could support their families. And time again, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's tied up a lot with white business, is seen to be siding with white markets rather than with the ordinary Black child on the street. So he is seen by many as taking the ANC towards a path of a white control and almost back to an apartheid type ruling system and away from the ideals of the ANC, which was to improve the lives of Black people, because Cyril Ramaphosa and largely the ANC has improved the lives of white people, ironically, not of the ordinary Black person. So I do think when we criticize Cyril Ramaphosa, we need to criticize the organization, a very proud, the oldest liberation party movement in the African continent, which has now sadly favored white interests rather than the dignity of the Black nation.
Please tell us more about your book, No White Lies. You have spoken at length about the lack of land justice.
I wrote a few years ago a book called No White Lies, and where I unpack Black politics and white power in South Africa. And I speak to the fact that white people have had no moral compass in this country, that we have failed to return land, which our forefathers stole from Black people in the most brutal fashion. We have failed to transform the economic landscape. We have failed to get down on our knees and beg for forgiveness, even though we've done so many sins, whether it's this generation or generations that came before us. So in my book, it's an appeal to the white consciousness in South Africa to say, dear white South Africans, it's time for us to give back the land. It's time for us to ensure that the damage that we've done to this country and to Black fathers, mothers, children, that we make reparations and we show remorse. And yet that's not being done. And I'm busy with my second book, which will be released in 2025, sorry, which also continues to tackle the pandemic of white privilege and power in South Africa, where Black people are living, absolutely, the majority of Black people are living in deep poverty. And most white people have still maintained their land, their privilege, and their wealth in a post-apartheid South Africa. It's a great shame.
Thank you, Kim Heller, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX.